The qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix brought a very intense session full of discussion points that we can analyze, from the unexpected elimination of Lawson and Antonelli in the first qualifying phase to McLaren's dominance in the front row and Ferrari's disappointing performance in the final phase. The grid is set for a big turnaround tomorrow under the rainy skies of Melbourne. But how did today's session go so wrong for Ferrari, and who was the biggest winner besides McLaren? Australia continues to surprise, and having both Williams drivers make it to the final phase for the first time in 10 years is just one of the factors making tomorrow's race even more awaited. However, there are many other stories that will certainly leave teams scratching their heads, starting with Antonelli and Lawson. The Mercedes driver went off track in the fourth corner and damaged the car's floor, costing him a lot of time in the last two attempts. In the end, it wasn't enough to hold on to 15th position and advance to the second phase. To make the irony even greater, he was eliminated by rookie Borto, who beat his teammate Hülkenberg and also Lawson, after being labeled as a second-rate driver by Helmut Marko. This was one of the strongest messages he could give in a situation like this, being pressured and intimidated by the veterans on the grid. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the stories of qualifying in Australia. Liam Lawson was by far the biggest disappointment of this Saturday, not just because he showed no promising signs during the first two practice sessions and lost the third, but also because it was expected that he would at least make it to the final qualifying phase at a time when his seat is under strong threat from Tsunoda, who will start from the fifth position and made a big statement to the entire Red Bull family. This is the last thing Lawson needed for his career within the Austrian team. Speaking about the reasons for his poor performance in qualifying, the New Zealander said they already expected a tough start. He commented that the first laps would naturally be slower, and the plan was to improve throughout the session, but going off track in the second lap messed everything up. He added that his final lap was good, but he lost a lot of time in the last sector. He mentioned that missing the third free practice didn't help, but in any case, he shouldn't have gone off track during qualifying. He revealed that before the ninth corner, he was half a second faster, but he had already had a small slide between corners 9 and 10, indicating that the tires were already starting to lose grip, something he had been struggling with throughout the weekend, and didn't get the chance to test in the third practice session. Lawson's situation doesn't look promising at all, since he entered the season under a lot of pressure with the expectation of getting closer to Verstappen. The Dutch driver will start from the second row, and although the gap to McLaren is significant, having Lawson in the final qualifying phase would have been a strong message for his future in the team. Instead, he now has to deal with rumors since the first race that he might be replaced by Tsunoda. If we look at the starting grid, the Japanese driver is just 2 positions behind Verstappen, exactly where the second Red Bull driver is expected to be. The car is difficult to drive, something both Verstappen and Lawson have admitted. But so far, the first qualifying session gave the impression that Lawson is just a disguised Perez. Now it's up to him to prove otherwise. He wasn't the only disappointment on the grid. Ferrari had a terrible performance in the final phase of qualifying and will now have to settle for a distant start in the fourth row in the 7th and 8th positions. The only hope for the Italian team is that the car was set up for the wet track conditions expected to dominate tomorrow's race. However, even in these circumstances, the hope isn't very high, as they are far from the leaders. Of course, anything can happen, and a big turnaround could benefit them greatly. But they could also end up being hurt, as they are stuck in the midfield, surrounded by drivers who could cause chaos. Hamilton spoke about the qualifying session and was asked about the car setup for the race, something he admitted he still needs to learn before the event. The 7-time world champion commented that, overall, he felt good and had a lot of fun on the track. He said everything has been a novelty this weekend, from his first practice with Ferrari to the practice sessions and qualifying, and that adapting to a car so different from what he's driven in the past has been a big challenge. He highlighted that he didn't expect to be so far behind, and that he needs to understand why the team couldn't keep up with the leader's pace. Hamilton mentioned that he had never driven this car in the rain and didn't even know the configurations for the wet track, so he would have to study them overnight before the race. He also said he would only have 3 laps to learn how the car behaves in those conditions before heading into the race. When qualifying in 8th place, the hope is that the track will be wet. But for him, that means he'll have to quickly learn how the car reacts in those conditions. Ferrari's only hope now is that the difference between Hamilton and Leclerc in qualifying wasn't too big. At one point, Hamilton was just 1/10 of a second slower than his teammate. However, there's a lot of work to be done, and Leclerc made a very negative prediction about Saturday's qualifying session, describing it as the worst he could imagine. He commented that since the morning, the car's performance hadn't been the same as the day before, and that he believes he knows the reason, but that they need to analyze the data. He explained that they made the right decision for the weekend, but it made them lose a bit of performance, and unfortunately, 7th and 8th places are disappointing because he didn't even consider that possibility. In the worst-case scenario, interesting stories also emerged from teams like Williams, which, along with Ferrari and McLaren, was the only team to get both cars into the final qualifying phase. This is a huge achievement for a team that caught attention in preseason testing in Bahrain. Verstappen also deserves praise because he definitely doesn't have the fastest car in hand, and, in certain conditions, not even the second fastest car, but he still managed to be the fastest after the McLaren cars. The Dutchman's expectations for this race were minimal because he knew he wouldn't have a chance to fight for the win against a car as competitive as McLaren's. However, with rain being his biggest ally, Max admitted that the Verstappen factor will be the team's biggest asset tomorrow. Whether he will be able to deliver a high-level performance and steal the victory from McLaren, only the race will tell. Speaking about McLaren, this is the team that could give us many answers about their performance throughout the season. Starting with both cars in the front row was exactly what they expected, with the most dominant car on the grid, but with 2 drivers determined to prove that they are the team's future champion. The race could be more competitive than we think. Piastri has already shown a lot of potential last season, and now that everything starts from scratch, we should expect nothing less than a start similar to Monza in 2024.